Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Depending on the time of day, you're catching the latest Say Your Piece with AD, you can accept whatever salutation I have to offer. Today I have a very special guest. And I'm not saying that because it's polite, but because this guest is a friend, is a brother, who I've literally gone to war with. Okay, now that might be a stretch. I don't.
War. That would be pretty fun.
Yeah.
No, not to all our friends who are in NS in Singapore. They probably have more experience with the warfare stuff.
Fair enough. What I was talking about was international competitive debating, which I have often, to the absolute horror of my friends, described or akin to war itself. So I apologize for all those who've actually been a part of war, but nonetheless, my brother in arms, Avinash Dash. And before you say anything else, Avinash, I prepared an intro music for you, which should be playing right about now. Let's add in the applause.
Thanks for that.
Perfect, Dash. Now, don't you feel like you're in a professional chat show setup?
I mean, it is a professional chat show setup, isn't it?
I offered you a beverage as soon as you came in.
Yeah.
I promised you the prospects of food sometime into this evening, right? And at the same time, I feel like I'm, at this point, 4 videos in, a professional chat show host.
Yep. You've got all that experience under your belt, man. This is going to be great. 4 videos in, we're going to talk about something controversial. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the way we should go about it, right? Like in this clickbaity universe of ours, it's always best to sort of hone some controversy, invite a bit of this back and forth, have these polarizing reviews. So absolutely, all of these things just fit the bracket. So Avinash, before we engage in any further banter or introduce all the Sangamas, all the people of the artisans to what we're going to do today, perhaps let's discover Avinash Dash.
All right, man.
Okay? We always put our guests on the spot by asking them who they are.
Yep.
So tell me, Avinash Dash, who is Avinash Dash?
So I like how you make it an extremely profound question. I feel like people are defined by their actions, so I go with the most basic one of what I do. So I am a product manager in a renewable energy company, and I find myself identifying with that role quite a lot, in that I like the idea of having creative control over an entire process, the ability to define objectives, the ability to define my own goals. And I think that I like the dynamic way in which my job works, and I think that kind of applies to my life as well. So I like to have creativity on what I'm going to do at any point in time. I like to set objectives myself that are short term and try to chase after them. And so debating was also kind of like that, in that I wanted to do something really big intellectually in university, and I was just randomly walking through the CCA fair of SMU called Vivace, SMU being the university we went to, for those who don't know. And they have this CCA co-curricular activity fair every year, and there were some guys from the hostel who had set up the stall, and I was wondering what the hell it was. It was SMU debating, and I thought, this could be a nice intellectual challenge, and I went in, and then the story just kind of started there.
The rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, pretty much.
Fair enough. Avinash, a lot of our viewers or a lot of people who tune in to these podcasts to learn about artists or art might be wondering, why is this project manager or product manager working in a tech startup who is also a famous debater? I mean, famous. I'm sure you can't see the air quotes. Why is he a part of this endeavor? Because Say Your Piece with AD is always about allowing an artist to speak about their lives, to speak about their art, and to speak about perhaps their artistic existence.
Yeah.
So why are we here today?
So historically, art has been about expression to me, and art has played a pretty major role in any big historical political movement. Like, if you look at the French Revolution, there's a huge amount of art around that. The entire Enlightenment has art around it. Going back to the Renaissance, going back to ancient history, art has been about the expression of ideas. Not to say that I am particularly experienced in expressing ideas through the medium of art, but I feel like engaging conversations are an important part of art, and being able to bring that in to some sort of engaging discussion, which I think is extremely important today, and something that does at least express itself in terms of music, for example,
Absolutely.
is extremely important.
In fact, at the end, what you just mentioned made a lot of sense. All art is expression. To express something, you might have to conceive an idea, or perhaps be a part of a movement, or perhaps have anything that is impactful to you experienced, right? And as a consequence, what we're here to do is talk about thoughts, ideas, social happenings that are relevant to the 21st century.
Yep.
And I'm sure there are a lot of creative minds out there who, not through the course of this conversation, but through their own experience of these happenings, will be creating or expressing themselves artistically. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think the people closest to this tend to who tend to experience firsthand the impacts of a social movement, like what we're seeing in America today, tend to be able to express those ideas in ways that we also can't necessarily cover in this kind of a discussion.
Absolutely.
So I feel like while we can have a more high-level discussion about what's happening and how people are feeling about this, the art itself is probably a deeper expression of it.
Of course.
And I'm looking forward to seeing how people use art to
remember these times.
To remember these times
Absolutely.
as like tragic as they are.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great segue into perhaps telling the audience what is unique about this moment in time. Correct. So for a lot of us who are perhaps experiencing a global pandemic, it's a first of its kind experience. I don't think the SARS epidemic or the swine flu epidemic perhaps had as significant an impact globally as the COVID pandemic has been. Right?
Yeah. There's nothing that's quite been like this in memorable history. Like if you speak to your grandparents, they're unlikely to remember any event like this where you'd have to stay at home in order to maintain your own personal safety. So
I mean, the closest experience that people relate to COVID is the Spanish flu, which was way back in the 1920s or the late
end of World War One.
End of World War One.
18, 19,
correct. And at that time, perhaps we didn't have the kind of technology or the kind of know-how of how we can mitigate some of the impacts. So work from home or perhaps lockdown was not concepts that were implementable at that time.
So the technology makes a big difference too, and I think in terms of the spreading of information, it made a big difference too. The response of global lockdown pretty much is something that just can't be achieved before the information age, because we knew very early on that the virus was spreading in China. We knew very early on what the nature of the disease is. We knew very early on that it can spread very easily. And so people around the world had sufficient time to plan a response to something that's quite this infectious.
Absolutely.
And that's probably why we see such a united global response to this
Absolutely.
crisis.
I mean, apart from the pandemic, which is a global phenomenon, we also see certain social happenings in the United States that has been a reason to generate a lot of discourse, to have important conversations around social or societal constructs such as race.
Absolutely.
And we are obviously specifically talking about the death, the murder of George Floyd. All the subsequent riots, all the subsequent protests, and all the subsequent movements that followed. Now, as adults, as individuals who are fairly well informed about what's happening around the world, this is not a unique happening.
Yeah.
We have seen such instances transpire in the past. What is unique about it is perhaps this intersectionality between a world that is on standstill and therefore has a lot more time to digest such information,
Yeah.
and this entire social movement that's going on, not just in the US at this point, but in many countries globally?
So, I think that the murder of George Floyd is a particularly insidious event in that he was seen as an upstanding citizen by most of the people who knew him. You see videos online of him condemning things like gang violence in black communities. So he was in many ways a model for a good black citizen in America.
Good citizen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but a good citizen, absolutely. And I use the word black there because it is something that people do consider when they look at. While they shouldn't, I agree. It's something that they do look at, and we can't deny the fact that there are people who do see racial differences as something inherent. And I think that him breaking down those racial differences was part of why this is such a tragic event, and why black people in America tend to rally around the messages that he spread out so much, because he is the counter to a lot of the racist narratives that are spread about black people in general, about them being inherently more violent, about them being unlawful.
Absolutely.
So it's extremely important to have messages like that spread around. And I think just before you step in again, Anirudh, I think that what triggered this is partly the pandemic, yes, and from the entire frustration and not being able to do much more standpoint. But I also think that the pandemic, this is pretty much a fact actually, has disproportionately affected black people in America. And if you look at the more the poorer areas of New York and Chicago, which were affected pretty early on, you tend to see a lot more spread in those regions, and it's taken pretty much a huge toll on the black community, which has led to these frustrations blowing up even more.
I mean, if you were to unpack that further, Dash, the reason why it's an extremely plausible fact, not just an opinion, as to why black communities or people of color are uniquely affected in such times is because of the kind of jobs that they mostly occupy as well. These are the kind of jobs that perhaps experience furloughs or experience unemployment right on day one of an economic crisis.
Yeah.
Correct? So it's not that implausible when you look at the numbers of per capita income for a black person in America, or for that matter people of color in America, in comparison to perhaps a white Caucasian male.
Yeah. Very often they are your essential workers, the guys who are clearing out your trash, the guys who are maintaining public transport. These blue-collar jobs are often occupied by people from the poorer areas of a large city, and they do often tend to be black, and that is unquestionably something that's led to them being impacted a lot more than people of more privilege.
Absolutely. So I think what we've done at this point is perhaps establish who we are. You already knew who I was, but you've also gotten to know my good friend Avinash, as well as why this is a unique moment in time as to the reason or the purpose of us having this discussion. I think before we unpack a lot of the things that have happened around the world, let's establish a few rules of discourse. Correct? Because we are in no way, in any shape or form, here in the capacity of experts or cultural psychologists, or perhaps even an active part of these social movements.
Yeah.
Correct. So we're here to dissect discourse. We're here to perhaps understand the current socio-racial happenings around the world, diagnose how these times play out, how they might potentially be remembered, and not necessarily express our opinions on any of these things. Perhaps just our understanding of what's happening is what we're going to exhibit or showcase to the course of this podcast.
Yeah, we're just an interested party, guys. We're just trying to unpack all of this. Any of you who are listening to this are probably curious about how other people look at these issues. And part of the reason why we want to do this podcast is to give out our understanding of these issues, but also to stimulate some sort of discussion around.
But we're no
What
one,
happens here?
Dash. Like, I am a founder or a co-founder of a startup that's an art aggregator. You're currently working as a product manager, a project manager in a tech company. So why is it important for the two of us to have this conversation?
Because we are the layman. Like, I feel like having experts constantly discuss these issues tends to leave a lot of the discourse in elite circles. What I mean by that is, and also it leaves that discussion inaccessible, I feel, to people who aren't part of those elite circles. I think one of the things that debate, at the very least, teaches us is how to bridge what experts talk about with some sort of like layman's perspective on issues. And so I feel like, at the very least, that gives us some sort of perspective that we can share.
Fair enough. And I feel beyond just expressing opinion, what we can accomplish during the course of a discussion is also a certain understanding or a certain rationalization of what's going down.
Yeah.
Because more often than not, I feel not just two of us, but many people in our lives or people around us, they're quick to form opinions on things.
Absolutely.
Right, without perhaps understanding all sides of an issue. And as debaters who are often not allowed to choose the side that they're going to debate, we have to analyze perhaps all different ends of a particular topic or a conversation. So we're going to use all of those learned skills, and we're not in any way, shape or form claiming to be experts even at debating for that matter.
No, we're not.
No, we're not. So I know if...
before any of our debate friends comes out and disses us for not being the best debaters out there.
No Asian champions or world champions here. But nonetheless, we're going to try our best. Yeah. So, Dash, I'm going to take a funneled approach to this conversation. So, we're going to first talk about some of these issues from more a construct perspective, which is independent of everything that's happening right now. And then we'll jump into the relevant facts or the relevant events that we've all experienced, right? So, a large part of our conversation is going to revolve around racial equality. Is going to revolve around this idea of equality in general, because I feel a lot of movements in today's day and age are striving towards equality, be it gender, be it race, be it caste for that matter in other countries like ours. So perhaps let's start off by broadly showcasing our understanding of race, right? So what does race mean to you?
That's a bloody complex question, man. And if you think about all the ways in which you could define race, that could be an entire conversation, and I think it could be way longer than the time that this podcast has to.
Okay.
To me, at the very least, it's pretty much a concept of differentiating people based off of inherent traits that they have.
Okay.
And I think that's the most simplistic definition of it, because it impacts us in ways that are much deeper than that. But inherent traits such as the color of your skin, such as the shape of your nose, which has actually like been the basis for like racial segregation in the past, can be used to discriminate against an entire group of people, saying that it's an us versus them kind of like mentality. And I think the entire concept of race boils down to an almost tribalism that can be dated back to
centuries ago. Right?
Yeah. You could say the very origins of human race, because we all started off as tribes. So that's absolutely something that's evolved into race that we see it right now, I feel. And
I feel in today's day and age, again, perhaps without deconstructing race from history going back and to bringing it back to today's times, I feel for me it's about unique experiences that a certain group of people perhaps share with each other, perhaps to different degrees of intensity, because there are other variables that interact with all of these identifiers or qualifiers that you've spoken about before, like privilege, that perhaps the place in the world that you're currently located in. There's so many other factors that interact with it to perhaps define the kind of experiences that you individually go through. But in general, my conception of it in today's day and age is these unique experiences that certain groups of people perhaps undergo or experience.
You put a very positive spin on the idea of race there.
No, I mean, unique experiences don't need to be positive or negative. They can be both, correct?
No, fair enough. Like,
Yeah.
but I feel like you define it more as a coming together of common characteristics,
Right.
and I define it more as a method that's used to differentiate yourself from others.
Right.
And I think that's an inherently different way of looking
Different
at
way
it.
of looking at
But that itself shows how complex the issue is, guys. Like,
absolutely. And that
even
deserves
within like 2 minutes, we find one way to completely look at it in different ways.
By the way, guys, this is the kind of conversation we have in preparation for a debate, which is why more often than not, when Dash and me team up together, by the time we have elapsed our preparation time, we have a blank sheet of paper because
15 minutes of prep time gone into defining what is race, guys.
so maybe we shouldn't spend those 15 minutes
Probably not. Yeah.
and move on. So I think we both have a certain understanding of race. I'm sure a lot of people tuning in will have their own understandings of the construct. And fair point, like fair game, it's based off what you've been exposed to. So let's then talk about recent events, right? And before we jump into what happened, how it was perhaps how it was consumed by people around the world and how they reacted to it, how were you exposed to the death or murder of George Floyd?
You're gonna like this one, Anirudh.
Okay.
So there was an Instagram post that I saw by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson
Okay.
that just read "I Can't Breathe,"
All right.
and it went on into a description of what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I was first exposed to the issue. I think this was maybe within 12 hours of it becoming public knowledge. So I was maybe a little late to the party on that. But
Dash, that's powerful. Not because it's Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and if this was another podcast, I'd be cracking a couple of jokes about it at this point. But because I feel "I Can't Breathe" dates far back in comparison to the George Floyd incident,
Yes.
right? Like, I don't think we associate "I Can't Breathe" just to the George Floyd incident. So when you read that statement, did you automatically know or feel that this was about something that had already happened before? Or it was history repeating itself in a way?
yeah, it was. And I think anytime something as tragic as this happens, it's very difficult to understand how to deal with the fact that something this bad happens in the world on a regular basis. And it feels like almost expected at a point in time that you're going to hear about a racially charged killing or a mass shooting, and that these are something that need to be seen as inherent problems because of the way they repeat themselves constantly. And there's no question that even within me, like, even though I'm not someone who is directly impacted by this issue, there is a lot of like indirect influence that it has over our own lives, because as human beings we do tend to see moral atrocities happening around the world, and feel like we want to come together to prevent something that tragic from happening again. And just the message that this guy was that he wasn't able to breathe in that point, and he was expressing that, and people still went ahead doing what they were doing to him. Absolute brutality as it is. It's an absolute tragedy, and it's very hard to
Right. So, Dash, I feel
wrap your
like
head around it.
the platform on which we consumed this piece of information was quite similar. So you found this post by Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson with just that one quote, which we have all come to see more often than not in such cases. I was exposed to it through a Telegram conversation. So for all of you who are not aware, Telegram is a platform much like WhatsApp. And a few of my friends, including yourself, were talking about this issue. And immediately I googled what this was all about, and that was my first exposure to the issue. But something interesting about this entire experience was, before I consumed the video that we are going to talk about, I was exposed to a bunch of opinions from you, from some of my other friends, even before I actually witnessed the video. Correct?
Yeah.
So perhaps, so that we declare our biases, we perhaps make everyone aware of all the information we've consumed about this. Could you tell me whether you viewed the video in isolation, or whether you consumed all content in relation to this in isolation, or what were some of the other things that you consumed along with the video itself?
So this is something that you need to be a little aware of, because but by that I mean, like, generally when consuming any content, in that it's very rare to find something that's completely free of bias. And that any video that is posted with a certain amount of context. And in the way in which you view a video as well is pretty much based on the context that you have gained from your experiences personally. So I did view it in isolation. I did see just the video, and naturally, from the way I could look at it, it was an absolute tragedy.
All right.
And there was nothing more I could feel at that point in time. But when you look at it from a certain lens, there are people who see this as something that's symptomatic of a much deeper problem, because they have experienced that much deeper problem every day. And it's difficult when people begin to dismiss that lived experience in favor of just saying that there are some bad apples who just do this.
Right. But again, I feel whatever you've just spoken about, or all the context that you've just laid for us, comes from an understanding of the situation far beyond the incident itself.
Yeah.
And the point I'm trying to get across over here is that there are so many people around the world who were acquainted to this video, who were acquainted to this happening, who perhaps looked at it as a police officer kneeling on top of a man's neck to the point where he was suffocating and was asking for release, without understanding the entire racial underlining or the entire racial context to this incident. So the whole question about how you consumed this video, or what were the opinions that you consumed along with this video, is said or is asked from the standpoint of addressing the fact that we more often than not don't view content in isolation.
That's right.
Right? And it's important to understand that. It's important to know that you are consuming opinions along with facts, because then you will be more aware of the biases that you form, or the opinions that you form. Is that fair?
It is fair. And very often what people who, anyone who wants to push a political opinion forward, very often what they'll do is cherry pick facts that fit the narratives that they're trying to push politically. And that tends to leave out a lot of the picture that people can see when it comes to any issue. So there is always a bit of a gap in a complete understanding of the issue, and it's very difficult to actually gain every perspective, because you also grow up with certain biases and would be more biased to accepting certain points of views than others. But you can try, and that would make you more informed and more capable of having a conversation on this with someone who differs with you.
Okay, I'm going to stop you right there. So you said that biases are something that you perhaps grow up with, right? Everyone has biases. It's impossible for someone to be 100% objective about something that is opinionated or something that is not sheer fact. Today's world, to be fair, even facts are argued upon endlessly. But how does
you are fake news?
Fair enough. Put a hashtag next to it, and that's some clickbait right there. But I want to ask you, how does one consume content, much like all the content generated around the murder of George Floyd, and rid all this content of the biases? How difficult is that, and how can we end up doing that? Like, perhaps
it's borderline impossible.
Okay.
And I think I think you need to try to be aware of your biases, but if you're going to try to be a perfectionist about it, you're almost certainly going to fail. Because it's just that difficult. You have people around you whom you have grown up with, who have influenced you in ways that you can't understand, really.
Right.
you have like powerful forces. Like you might have grown up in a religious context where you're going to church every week, and a lot of your opinions are shaped, not shamed, by the pastor at the church, and that and that opinion, which is formed in your childhood, where you're not really rationalizing everything so much as you're emulating what you see around you, does impact your perspective on the world a lot, and that's where we see a lot of that's where we see such deep disagreement between people on an issue like this, where someone who's grown up in an environment where racially charged crimes are almost a daily happening, versus someone who's grown up in an environment where you barely interact with the other race. It's very difficult to see eye to eye when the entire world that you've known growing up is very different.
Correct.
And you have to be aware of that, I feel. But you can't fully understand what someone from the other world sees in the issue because you haven't really lived their experiences.
So it's difficult to empathize.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think you can empathize. I think you can't really understand, though. And I think that level of humility is good enough to have a good conversation about it.
So this is something that I often find myself conveying to Dash, right? In all the interactions that I've had with him about race, about society, about philosophy, about life in general, he is aware that he doesn't know, right? And I feel approaching such content or approaching such conversations would be a lot more healthy if people realize that there's a lot about these things that they don't know, right? And when you come in or walk in with that acceptance is when you're less likely to carry all the biases that we just spoke about during that conversation.
Yeah.
You'd be willing to listen, you'd be willing to hear someone else's experiences, and as a consequence be a lot more well-rounded in your understanding of the subject.
Yeah. So I just want to bring in something more here. So I feel like in the world today, people have moved beyond the value of conversation, and I feel like that's something that we need to address too. So for example, there's a whole lot of no platforming happening right now, where someone who hasn't experienced a certain point of view isn't really considered to have the right to speak about it. And I feel like that's something we need to address too. Why is open conversation so important? So I wanted to understand your perspective on this too.
Fair enough. And we have an entire segment devoted to Dash where we speak about how and who has these conversations. So as much as Dash is looking for a compelling answer to his question, there is one coming his way, but you got to hold on to that.
Yeah, excited for that.
So let's further diagnose what's gone down here. I feel there was widespread emotion about the George Floyd murder, George Floyd death, and unilaterally people condemned his death, right? You had people from all sides of the political spectrum speaking about how this was in fact a tragic incident, right?
Yeah.
Of course, they viewed it through a different lens, but all of them agreed that this was a tragedy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, of course, we're not talking about those one or two anomalies. We're speaking about most people around the world.
For sure. Yeah.
But what was a lot more controversial, or what was perhaps a lot more polarizing, was the subsequent protests, were the subsequent social or political movements that accompanied these protests. And while none of this is unique to the George Floyd incident, again, the world took notice because the world was on standstill, right? So based on all the information, based on everything that you've seen on social media, across the news, what is the conversation, perhaps just on a high level, about these protests?
So broadly, I think I see three camps to this. I think there's the one camp which is the protest is good, the looting and rioting is also acceptable because of the outrage that the black community rightly feels on this issue. I think there's a more moderate community there that says, like my good friend CA and I talked yesterday about how
Are
moderate.
we name dropping our friends now?
Yeah,
Okay.
we are. So shout out to CA. So he and I had a conversation about how moderate is a bit of a dirty word in politics these days,
Okay.
and I tend to agree with him in that moderation seems to be seen as a good thing because of the way the word has connotation to it, but it isn't necessarily anything productive.
Right.
But yeah,
Dude is sitting on the fence.
exactly.
Yeah.
So there's the moderates who I feel agree that the protests are separate an important political message, but absolutely condemn the
rioting and the looting,
rioting.
yeah.
And I think there's then there's a I think there's a similar camp. So I think there's a similar, slightly more right-wing moderate camp, which sees the message of the protest itself as illegitimate, but kind of like supports the right of such a movement to be happening.
Mhm.
And
The freedom to free speech, the freedom to
Yeah.
make a public gathering and protest. Basically, they support the action because it's constitutionally a right given to people, but
Yeah.
not the message itself.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And then you have the other most noisy group on this, which is just condemning the entire thing as something that shouldn't be happening because the murder of George Floyd was an isolated event that happened because of one bad apple, and you can't just protest the entire police force as a result of that. So there's a spectrum here, and I think that's also an oversimplification of the
Landscape.
the landscape on this conversation.
But yeah,
So going back to
yeah. Sorry. Go. The reason why I'm interrupting you here, Dash, is perhaps to give some context behind that question, right? So it's important to understand where these different discussions are happening, or who is or who's having these discussions, so that you are again able to locate political motivations, existing biases, and then make an opinion for yourself as to where you stand on this issue, right? Which is why
Yeah.
it's important to, one, educate yourself on everyone that's involved and what they are talking about or where they stand,
yeah.
right? So now that you've identified all of these different parties or all of these different movements or opinions, how do you educate yourself about them?
So I think to most people, so I said I would give 3 camps, but I think it's actually 4 camps. But I think like these 4 would tend to cover under an umbrella most people, or at least like anyone who's looking at the issue externally would see these 4 groups and think that this is a pretty good representation of what's happening. But I think that that's a simplification of the idea of protest altogether. And I think they tend to overlook how very often within a protest, while you have a similar message, you don't really have an organized movement. You don't really have control over who does what. And you may have different figureheads, all of whom want the same political outcome, using very different methods to go about it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that even political parties, which are a lot more organized in terms of a political movement experience, different leaders within the political party have different ways of achieving the same outcomes, right? So again, like, I'm sorry, I'm going to bring you back to the question I asked. We've now identified on a broad spectrum the likely opinions that lie. But how do we educate ourselves about all these opinions and where they come from? Because I think that is more important than diagnosing what is a right or wrong opinion. Right? So how do we go about that process?
So I think you do a few things here. So if you're used to watching CNN, watch a little bit of Fox News. I think that's the most simple stuff that you can do.
Okay.
But also consume any media with some amount of healthy skepticism, in that you know that there's some true information in whatever the media is presenting to you, but try to understand how they're trying to present it to you and shape it in a certain way that impacts your view of the subject, rather than just looking at the entire article and accepting that as fact.
So one, ensure that you're looking at different sources of information.
Yeah.
Second, identify the political leanings of each of these different sources of information and try and consume it as holistically as possible.
Yeah.
Theoretically, that makes a lot of sense. That's information that we actively pursue, right? Either by following a CNN page on Facebook,
Yeah.
right? Or by tuning into Fox News through a YouTube stream or just on television. But what about all the information that we're consuming socially?
Mm-hmm.
We have been a part of many active debates, many active conversations about this issue. And there are people who, again, lie on different sides of the spectrum, right? Without naming any of them, some of them support even the rioting, the looting, while there are others who strongly condemn it, right? Over here, we don't have specific political affiliations to understand where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the lens through which we consume all of this information socially?
That's a much harder question to answer.
Right.
And so you can't just look at a person and understand and label their political leanings just by one conversation with them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it takes a much deeper analysis of that person to really get down to the bottom of that.
Right.
At the very least, the difference in media houses is that their leanings have been well analyzed historically, so you can understand them and be aware of them.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're talking to the people around you, I think it just comes down to some level of skepticism, in that you learn from history. People who are experts, they probably have studied the issue a lot more than you. You learn from them, but you also treat them with some amount of skepticism, in that you... I think that the way in which you need to do that has to be active. You have to seek out other opinions in order to really understand them, or give them, or accommodate them at all, I feel.
So I'm going to use a Dashism, as I often like to quote my good friend Dash and label it as a Dashism. I feel in these social bubbles, or in these echo chambers, if you leave with more questions than answers, then I feel you're better suited to understand this conversation or this event more holistically. What we shouldn't be doing, I feel, in these social circles or on these social platforms, is looking for a definite answer, right? I feel we consume these opinions and then ask ourselves why these opinions exist. You don't need to come up with an answer to that question.
Yeah.
But the fact that you have that question in mind means that there is a skeptic in you.
Yeah.
And he or she is questioning that these opinions are also based off biases.
Yeah.
Right? So I feel even in a social bubble where it's very difficult to qualify opinions as liberal, as conservative, as Republican, as Democrat, you have to have that skeptic in you who is more willing or more looking forward to asking questions rather than looking for definite answers. Right? So I feel that's two ways in which we can, one, tackle information we consume from the media, which we are actively assessing or accessing, and also information that we consume socially.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. So I think that...
Hashtag Dashism, sorry.
Hashtag Dashism, okay, fine. Well, that's going to be a hashtag that runs around. If that actually becomes a popular hashtag, Anirudh, like, I'm going to kill you, man.
You're going to give me royalties, forget killing me.
You're using my name and you're asking for royalties, what the hell, dude?
You're going to monetize it, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I might keep that.
Yeah.
So just to go back to that, I think my understanding of... I think my opinion on skepticism has kind of like evolved a little bit since we last spoke about this too, Anirudh. And that I agree it's important to leave a conversation with intriguing questions, because that is open to that's open to interpretation and open to accommodating different opinions. I feel though that you can't always approach a conversation that way. I think it's almost idealistic to expect people to do that. And there needs... I think then what you need to... I can't even say it as you need to do. How I address the issue then is I tend to just be okay with the way the world is after I understand that there are different opinions, rather than trying to diagnose what's the best way to reconcile these opinions.
Right. No. Absolutely. I don't think the objective of leaving with questions is to find the best opinion.
Yeah.
Right? It's to, one, acknowledge that multiple opinions exist. There are reasons or justifications as to why these opinions exist.
Yeah.
And once you understand that, then forming your own opinion. So your opinion might be anything. It might be on one end of the spectrum, it might be on the other end of the spectrum, or it might be smack in the middle. correct? But at least it's formed as a means of, or as a consequence of understanding all these varied opinions, rather than simply consuming one line of thought.
Exactly.
Right? The third thing that I want to add to this conversation, and you can chip in whenever you want, is don't let your conversation be the end of the thought process that you've devoted to this particular topic, right? So once you've had a conversation about George Floyd, right, and if you don't have a historical context behind racial violence or racial segregation or discrimination, then read up about it, right? Beyond just a Wikipedia entry, find out what is the historical background behind slavery, for example, in America, the liberation of slaves in 1863, right? The civil rights movement that happened in the 1950s and the 60s, right? And how all of that has evolved into the events that are transpiring today. So once you are aware that there are multiple opinions, you have actively chosen to diagnose, in the case of media outlets, what are the biases that they have in presenting those opinions. You also then do a bit of factual research as much as you possibly can, because even these articles to an extent are opinionated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't have something that's absolutely free of bias. So even if you're reading into it, just know that you're reading multiple sources of information that also have their own biases.
Biases, correct. So, but at the very least, you're consuming a lot more information about the subject, and therefore you're a lot more aware, right? So I feel this three-pronged process, it's not the golden rule of having conversations or forming opinions, but I feel it's one that we can safely recommend.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's a good way of perhaps not closing, but at the very least segueing from our conversation about how people have perceived the protests and the opinions that they have formed about this. So now let's deconstruct people who actually have opinions.
Yeah.
Right? And I find this an extremely amusing conversation because the jokes and all the banter that follows dissection of particular opinions we find online. Right? And many a times, and now I'm going to come to the whole idea of no platforming, right? Or of this idea of only specific people should speak about certain things. Is that something that you agree with? Like, I know for a fact, knowing you as a person, you're not going to say that only a black man or a white man or a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim or a Christian should speak about something. I know that's not what you're going to say, but do you feel that there should still be some qualifiers in terms of expressing public opinion?
I feel like there should be some way to assess whose opinion is more important in the issue than others.
Okay.
And I think that comes from being experienced with the issue, having studied the issue, being close to the issue. I feel like it's much more arbitrary in the cases of where, for example, so for example, like Alex Jones being no platformed at Oxford, like he's someone who has had political opinions for a long time, and as ridiculous as they are most of the time, it's not like we should prevent him from ever speaking up, but it's important for him to speak up, and we treat that as some sort of like and we treat that as a silly opinion that it really is.
Right.
I feel so. Rather than shutting down conversation, I would rather the conversation happen and we label that for what it is.
Okay, so you're saying that there should be no barriers to entry when it comes to expressing a public opinion, as long as the person is well read or is well informed about the issue, as outrageous as their opinion might be. But post expressing their opinion, we should qualify it for what it is.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with that, Dash, and this is where like perhaps the debater instinct kicks in, is in today's day and age, people are willing to consume outrageous opinions because it aligns with their internal beliefs, right? Or it perhaps is in support of a individual who they agree with on other issues, right? So they might not have strong opinions about a particular issue. They might even feel like the person perhaps is not making much sense, but because there's a strong affinity to the person because of other factors, they choose to, support this person or side with this particular individual and form their opinions as a consequence. So isn't that then creating perhaps a toxic environment when we allow all sorts of environments? Again, that's not my opinion. It's something that many people do bring out, right? Like we should curb certain opinions because they're just toxic.
Yeah, some opinions are just toxic. Some people are just outrageous. But I feel like outrage and what you perceive as toxic is often received rather than purposefully created.
Mm-hmm.
So, if someone is taking themselves seriously,
Mm-hmm.
they would rarely see themselves as being purposefully toxic.
Right.
That would take something. What was the guy who was the most hated guy in the world? The guy who raised the price of the AIDS drug.
Oh my
Like
God.
that guy is just a toxic troll.
Right.
Yeah, it's good I don't remember his name. Don't want to remember
Yeah.
him.
Let's
He's an
not give
absolute
him.
asshole.
Let's not give him our platform.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we know platform
We
anyway.
don't platforming him.
But yeah, I think like barring guys like that who are just purposeful trolls, most people who form an opinion don't do so thinking that they're just purposefully being toxic.
All right.
And I think that you need to see that first. I think the second thing that they try to do is they try to gain some sort of political traction. So usually if someone is expressing an opinion very loudly, they're not the only people who feel that opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that if that opinion is dangerous, then there is a need to address it because there are other people who feel that way. If you platform them, it's quite likely you drive that opinion underground. You keep people who have that opinion within an echo chamber, who just never engage with the outside world. And because they're stuck in that echo chamber, that opinion gets reinforced further and further. And it just becomes very difficult to address to the point where in some countries it's led to things like neo-Nazism rising again.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. You have a Charlottesville.
Yeah.
For that matter, even in Poland, for that matter, you've seen the rise of the far right, and it did influence elections even in France, right, where Marine Le Pen was did get a lot more political traction than what was
Right.
initially conceptualized or predicted.
So just to clarify there, I understand that going from no platforming to neo-Nazism is a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
And there isn't like necessarily a direct causation there. But there's always a risk of driving opinions underground
Mhm.
that leads them to fester, and we should be aware of that when we're constantly suppressing people from speaking.
I think from a very logical standpoint rather, it's better to know everything that's out there.
Yeah.
Right, rather than perhaps interact with something once it's volcanoed into something that's a lot more impactful and a lot more toxic. So I feel just letting these opinions exist, addressing them and doing so in a mature, educated manner, and giving them an ability to try and defend themselves, and as a consequence perhaps change a few minds, would maybe be a better way of going about things. But again, that's just our opinion on the matter. But again, we're speaking about people who already have a platform or who have loud voices that we're all acquainted with, right?
Yep.
But if you look at it from a very layman perspective, we interact with different people, correct, who have many a times well-informed opinions, and then there's some people who are just speaking from their backside, right?
Yeah.
Because they want to be relevant, they want to talk about things that the world is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How do we address the platform we give to these people? Be it on our own social media platforms, be it in the Telegram or WhatsApp chats that we have. We obviously like them as friends,
Mm-hmm.
which is why they're still a part of our life, or at the very least they are our acquaintances.
Yeah.
And they might have opinions which are far different from ours, right? So how do we have conversations in these silos?
So, like at least in my experience, because of the friends we have, possibly, these kinds of opinions usually come out as a bit of a joke.
Okay.
As in they are framed purposefully as humor rather than something that's a serious opinion.
Right. No, but to be fair, like I've been a part of family group chats or
Right.
right, a part of social groups that, are not really that aware, or perhaps they have other things that they involve their time with, rather than like checking on world events or reading up on different articles about social issues. So they form opinions based on, again, all the biases that each one of us have been brought up with, and based on what they see on television. Right?
Okay, so please call out the WhatsApp conspiracy theorists. Please call out your families who are just spreading random like racist messages inside your family group chats.
So call them out.
Yeah, just call them out.
Okay.
Like I think it's important to do that because it's important. So as much as I say that it's important to have the right questions rather than having the right answer to what an opinion is, there are some opinions which ultimately do end up causing more harm than good.
Okay, no, so Dash, again, maybe let me contextualize this question, right, so that we get a little more specific in the manner in which we approach this subject. You spelled out 4 different camps or 4 different ideologies in relation to the protests surrounding George Floyd's death, murder. And one of it involved condemning the rioting or looting, right? And there were people who also wrote on social media in support of rioting and looting because they made an argument of broken social contracts, and as a consequence, everything is fair game, right? Now, how do we address or perhaps debate or talk to these people when it's on a Facebook wall where it's exposed not just, or rather it's not a conversation that you're having with that individual, but with everyone that follows you or is your friend on that platform, correct? Because everyone has different degrees of information.
Yes.
Everyone is either less or more informed. So how does those conversations happen constructively?
So I think the precursor to that is having more information yourself.
Okay.
So yes, guys, it's important to read up. It's important to try to understand issues if you really want to defend your opinion on those issues, or even challenge your opinion on those issues.
But are these good platforms to have conversations?
I think they are good platforms to have those conversations.
Okay.
So if they're public, it means it's even better because you're more likely to have a third opinion that didn't exist before, like brought into the entire discussion, and that could be something that's game changing in having a debate as well. Closing houses for all you debaters.
For all you debaters, okay, correct.
And I think that absolutely is a good thing. So I feel like if you I think the problem of echo chambers that we see on Facebook, for example, is an extension of the problem of echo chambers that's always existed. The echo chambers, rather than being physical, though, in terms of having people who are in close proximity, have become ones of Facebook groups or like certain pages where you're having online discussions with people with similar opinions.
Right.
So I think there's both a good and a danger to that. The good being that if it's more public, you're more likely to see other opinions. But also, if you have more people around the world who share a similar opinion, you're likely to have an opinion that's dangerous for more and more.
Right.
And that's why you have to actively understand what your echo chambers are and move out of it to make sure that you're not stuck in an opinion that could cause harm to others.
Right. So I think there is something positive that can come out of a Facebook post that is an expression or that is an opinion about a particular social event. But in order to engage with it, whether or not you disagree or agree with this post, be well informed yourself to start off with. Secondly, accommodate other opinions that come as a consequence of reacting to that post. And finally, perhaps understand that even these opinions carry the same biases that we spoke about previously, right? So if you end up with more questions than answers, then again, that's fine, right? So at the end of the day, I feel whatever be the platform, no matter what the opinion is, it's based on what you want to find or gain out of that conversation.
It is, yeah.
That results in whether or not you've made a well-informed opinion, whether you've considered all facts, all biases. So it's totally on you.
Yeah.
I think that is fairly non-controversial. Dash, we're now going to transition to perhaps talking about how we remember things, because all of these events are fairly current. They are happening in the now. 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, how do you think we're going to process everything that went down in 2020?
So I feel like some of the things we will always use to remember historical events are artistic expression. And just kind of like tying it back to the art theme of your podcast, I think it's important to...
Is this where we talk about This Is America? No, we don't.
Yeah, This Is America's art. There are some people who just go like anything is art, but I disagree with that opinion somewhat. In that I find that artistic expression does make us remember these historical events a lot more. So for example, if we look back to Tiananmen Square, the one big symbol of that movement is the video of the guy standing in front of those 3 tanks. Or was it 4? 3, I think. Yeah, but that's how we remember that entire incident, and that's an image that's so powerful that it's ingrained in our memories forever, that this was something that happened, this was a tragic event, and this guy was so strongly against the oppression that he was facing that he was willing to stand in front of 3 huge tanks. And I think that's the kind of power that art has over remembering history. Quite similarly, we even remember.
So again, like you talked about this powerful visual, right? That's ingrained in your memory. That's ingrained in the memory of a lot of our listeners. But what I'm getting at perhaps is history or is remembrance bereft of all the opinions that surrounded that particular event at that moment?
Exactly, it's not. Okay. So,
or is it more bereft, or is it like more likely to be accompanied with all of those opinions?
So I don't think it's more or less. So historical accounts. So especially when you look at things that go into textbooks, for example, they're peer-reviewed a lot in academic circles to try and be as free of bias as possible. So academic peer reviews tend to point out potential places where you have bias, and if a particular academic article is found to have too much bias, then that can be straight up rejected for presenting information inaccurately. That is that, at least in terms of like maintaining historical records, is likely to take away a lot of the bias on these issues, but also that's like, while I'm talking about like historical accounts in their entirety, I'm not talking about like specific historical accounts which are not going to be free of bias,
right,
which are often going to be more biased as well,
right,
because things like victor's justice, the benefit of hindsight, all of that kind of like falls into falls into how we account for history,
which is why, like, I feel the fact that we have technology means that the archival process of a lot of these events are going to be a lot better, would be a lot more vivid for all those who consume it at a later time. So I feel, given the socio-economic status or the environment at that point in time, there will be new opinions, right? I'm sure the way Martin Luther King's famous speech, "I Have a Dream," was consumed back then by a lot of people is different from the way it's consumed right now. I'm sure it's more overwhelmingly positive right now than it was, say, back then, correct? So, of course, those are those interactions as well.
Yeah.
The reason why I'm having this conversation about how these times will be remembered is to perhaps widen the scope of our opinion formation and understand that whatever we're experiencing today, we might feel very differently about a few years down the line.
Absolutely.
Right? And just being in tune with that will give you a broader understanding of these issues, because then you think back to how you remember things that happened before.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe when you do your research or do look up these events, you might realize that people thought about these things very differently back then. Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that too is a good dimension to this conversation.
Indeed. Yeah. I agree with that completely. Not much to say on it.
Not much to say on that.
It's true.
It's
That's
true.
all. Yeah.
Right. So guys, again, I think we covered quite a few things, and I'm very sorry if we weren't particularly organized as we usually are, but I felt like this topic or this entire conversation required a bit of chaos, required a bit of disorganized thought, because at the end of the day, we were just two individuals telling you what we felt about this entire ordeal that the world is going through, right?
Yes, guys, that's about it.
And so, if you got any value from this podcast, I hope it is not an opinion, because I'm sure some opinions might have slipped through, even though we promised we're going to be as unbiased as possible. But how we choose to consume information, how we choose to perceive information, and how we form opinions as a consequence. It's not a gold standard, again, but it's something that I am quite unafraid to advocate, right? So ask questions, realize that biases exist everywhere, even within yourself, and then think about how these things will be remembered in the future. And through that entire conversation that you have with yourself, I feel you'd be a lot more secure about the opinions that you have, and you'd likely to be more accommodative of other opinions.
Indeed, yeah. And I think that personally, if you want to learn more about issues, I think you can't fix the problems of the world by having that sort of approach, but you can improve how informed you are about these issues by taking on that approach. And I think that, at least for me, I tend to treat the world with a lot more skepticism, so that I can learn more. And I think that that's where...
Skepticism equals hashtag Dashism.
So, yeah, maybe that should be the closing statement.
That should be the closing statement. But overall, guys, I hope all of you are going to experience better times soon, be it socially, be it from a health standpoint. While the pandemic is receding in certain regions, it is still escalating in others. So I wish all of you the pink of health. Hopefully the world as a unit, as a global unit, will come out of these times stronger, will come out of these times wiser, and most importantly, will come out of these times more united. So wish all of you again a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night, depending on the time of day you're consuming it. Thanks a ton to my good friend Dash.
Hold on, one moment.
Yeah.
You're not much of a YouTuber, are you?
No, I'm not.
So, guys, if you like this podcast, smash that like button. If you like the podcast that will come out before and you want more content like this, click subscribe. And if you want to get the podcast as soon as it comes out, hit that notification bell so that you get that notification on your phone. Sell out a little more. Let's go.
Absolutely. And guys, I'm really grateful that Dash did this, because depending on the success or failure of this podcast, Dash might be a returning guest. That's right. So say your piece with AD might then signify Anirudh and Dash rather than Anirudh Dalmia. So, the name is already
I'm
working.
also Avinash Dash. Like, if both of us are AD.
AD square then. Okay, no, that's lame.
No.
Yeah,
That's AD whole square.
Okay, this is clearly steering the wrong way. So this is as good a time as any to bid adieu.
Yeah.
Right? So Dash, any parting words?
Yeah, man. I had fun talking about this. It's important to talk about this too. So, yeah, I'd be happy to do this again.
Perfect.